In the summer of 1941, as the German army swept across the vast plains of the Soviet Union, a new shape began to emerge from the dust. It was low, almost invisible against the horizon, where the Panzer tanks stood tall with their rotating turrets. This machine crouched close to the ground, its flat armor angled like a blade. And when it fired, the shock of its 75mm gun tore through the air with surgical precision. To the infantry moving forward behind it, this weapon was a lifeline. To the enemy tank crews watching through the haze, it was a ghost that struck first and vanished just as quickly. This was the Sturmgeschütz III, the assault gun that would become the backbone of German armored warfare. Conceived not as a tank, but as a tool of the artillery, its story began long before the first shots of the Second World War. In the trenches of the previous conflict, German commanders had learned a brutal lesson. Infantry could advance only as far as artillery could follow. The heavy guns of the Great War were powerful but immobile, and the soldiers often faced bunkers, machine gun nests, and fortified villages without direct fire support. A young officer named Erich von Manstein carried that memory into the new age of mechanized warfare. By 1935, he proposed a new kind of vehicle, not a tank to duel with other tanks, but an armored gun to move with the infantry and crush whatever stood in their path. It would be part of the artillery branch, not the Panzer Corps, and its role would be simple: destroy obstacles, strong points, and enemy fortifications through direct fire. The German army called it Sturmartillerie, assault artillery. To build it, Daimler-Benz took the chassis of the Panzer III and stripped away its turret. In its place, engineers fitted a fixed, low superstructure housing a short 75mm howitzer. The result was a squat, compact machine, lighter, cheaper, and faster produced than any tank of its class. In 1937, 5 prototypes were completed by the Alke factory in Berlin, and after trials, the first production models rolled out in early 1940. When the Wehrmacht invaded France, the Stug, as crews quickly called it, proved its worth. It could keep pace with the infantry, flatten bunkers with high explosive shells, and survive heavy fire thanks to its low silhouette. But its real potential was only beginning to emerge. In the East, the Germans soon met a new threat: the Soviet T-34 and KV-1, with their sloped armor and thick plating. The short gun of the early Stug could not penetrate them. In response, the vehicle was rearmed with a long 75mm high-velocity cannon, the Stuka 40L/48, transforming the assault gun into a lethal tank destroyer. From that moment, the Stug evolved beyond its original purpose. It became the practical answer to Germany's growing shortage of tanks and resources. Without a turret, it was simpler to produce, requiring fewer materials and less time on the assembly line. By 1944, factories under Albert Speer's wartime economy were building as many as 500 each month. The Ausführung G, the final and most numerous version, introduced heavier armor, side skirts, and a distinctive Sawkop gun mantlet, the pig's head that gave the vehicle its unmistakable profile. On the battlefield, the Stug earned a reputation that exceeded its modest origins. Crews learned to use terrain, concealment, and ambush tactics with devastating effect. Its gun could disable almost any Allied tank, and its low height, barely that of a standing soldier, allowed it to disappear behind ridges, fences, or even shallow ditches. In defensive warfare, where every tank counted, the Stug became indispensable. By 1944, more assault guns were being built than tanks, and they accounted for tens of thousands of enemy armored kills across the eastern and western fronts. Yet its success was not only mechanical, but also human. The men who served in the Sturmartillerie were not tankers, but gunners, trained in the traditions of artillery. They read the battlefield differently, calculating angles, ranges, and cover, fighting with precision rather than maneuver. Inside the cramped hull, for men worked in perfect coordination: driver, gunner, loader, and commander. The new rotating cupola allowed that commander to observe the battlefield through periscopes without exposing himself, a small innovation that dramatically improved their survival and situational awareness. By the war's end, the Stug had fought on every front, from the deserts of North Africa to the ruins of Berlin. It was the most produced tracked armored vehicle of the German army, a machine that embodied both the ingenuity and desperation of the Reich's final years. Even after Germany's defeat, its story continued. Finland kept its Stu-GS in service until the early 1960s, nicknaming them Sturmy. A few found their way to the Middle East, where Syrian crews used them in the wars of the 1950s and 60s, their German steel now facing Israeli armor under a different sun. The Sturmgeschütz III was not born to hunt tanks, nor to lead charges. It was built to serve the infantry, and in doing so, it became one of the most effective and iconic weapons of the entire conflict. A machine that began as a support gun became the backbone of German armored warfare, the silent companion of soldiers on every front. And behind its cold, riveted armor lay a question that defines much of wartime engineering. When does a weapon, designed for one purpose, evolve into something far greater or far more tragic than its creators ever intended? When the German army began its secret rearmament in the mid-1930s, its thinkers faced a dilemma that no amount of steel or ambition could immediately solve. They had inherited the lessons of the Great War, a conflict of trenches and immovable front lines, but they were now building a new kind of army, one that promised speed, precision, and overwhelming firepower. Yet amid the enthusiasm for fast-moving tank divisions, a quieter vision emerged, one that saw victory not in sweeping maneuvers, but in close cooperation between infantry and armor. It was here that the idea of the assault gun was born. The man who crystallized this concept was Erich von Manstein, then a young and brilliant officer of the German General Staff. Manstein believed that infantry, no matter how well trained or equipped, would always face moments when their advance stalled, when enemy fortifications or machine gun nests turned progress into slaughter. He had seen this before in the grim stalemates of the Western Front during the First World War, where even a few bunkers could hold back entire divisions. What the infantry needed, he argued, was not heavier artillery far behind the lines, but mobile guns that could move beside them, under armor, and deliver direct fire when the fight reached its most desperate point. In 1935, Manstein presented his proposal to General Ludwig Beck, the chief of the German Army General Staff. He called it Sturmartillerie, assault artillery. The weapon he envisioned would not be a tank in conventional sense, nor would it belong to the Panzer branch. It would be the artillery's armored fist, operating at the forward edge of battle, breaking fortifications and supporting the foot soldier in the assault. It was, in essence, a bridge between the static guns of the past and the mobile warfare that was about to reshape Europe. The idea intrigued the Army Weapons Office, which saw in a practical and relatively economical concept. In June of 1936, the Daimler-Benz company received an order to develop a prototype. The requirements were clear and uncompromising. The vehicle had to carry a 75mm gun capable of high explosive fire. It had to be fully enclosed to protect its crew, and it could not be higher than a standing man. Such a low silhouette would allow it to advance close to the enemy while remaining difficult to detect or hit. To meet this challenge, Daimler-Benz engineers turned to a chassis already in production, that of the Panzer Dre medium tank. It was reliable, well-balanced, and could be adapted quickly without major retooling. By removing the turret and replacing it with a fixed, armored superstructure, they created a vehicle that was simpler, lighter, and easier to produce. This casemate design, though limiting the gun's traverse to a narrow angle, gave the machine a lower profile and stronger frontal protection. The first 5 prototypes, built by Alkit and Berlin-Tegel in 1937, mounted the short 75mm Stu-K Siebenundreissig gun. The barrel was stubby, designed for high-explosive rounds that could shatter bunkers or field positions rather than pierce armor. These early vehicles, known as the Sturmgeschütz Ausführung A, carried only light armor, just enough to shield the crew from small arms and shrapnel, but they demonstrated the principle beautifully. For the first time, the German army possessed a self-propelled gun that could keep pace with infantry and deliver immediate, accurate fire against hardened targets. Field trials confirmed the value of the concept. Infantry units reported that having the Sturmgeschütz nearby gave them a sense of protection and confidence that traditional artillery could not. Where enemy strongpoints had once stalled advances, a few well-placed shells from the Stu-G could clear the path within minutes. The vehicle's low silhouette and solid frontal armor made it surprisingly resilient against return fire, especially when used from concealed positions or behind natural cover. It was not a glamorous weapon, no turret, no dramatic speed, but it was a soldier's machine built for purpose rather than spectacle. Still, there was uncertainty about where it belonged in the Army's growing structure. The Panzerwaffe, already dominated by figures like Heinz Uderian, saw little use for a turretless gun when new tank models were being designed. The infantry had neither the training nor the logistics to manage armored vehicles. Eventually, a compromise was reached. The Sturmgeschütz would remain under control of the artillery branch. Its units would be called Sturmartillerieabteilungen, assault gun battalions, and would operate independently, supporting infantry divisions wherever needed. This decision shaped the character of the Stu-G and the men who would command it. Unlike tank crews, who thought in terms of maneuver and mobility, the assault gunners approached battle as a problem of fire and geometry. They studied fields of fire, cover, and line of sight with the precision of artillerymen, and when the fighting began, they relied on patience, discipline, and coordination rather than speed. This difference would later prove decisive in the defensive campaigns that awaited them. By 1940, mass production began. The first series, known as the Ausführung B, incorporated modest improvements, thicker armor, better optics, and minor adjustments to the superstructure. These vehicles went into action during the invasion of France and the Low Countries. There, the Sturmgeschütz proved invaluable in urban and fortified terrain. Crews learned to use their low height to move close to enemy positions, firing directly into bunkers or walls. Infantry commanders quickly realized that wherever a Stu-G operated, casualties dropped and progress accelerated. But the very success of the early German blitzkrieg would temporarily overshadow the assault gun's potential. Generals like Uderian, who favored speed and concentrated armor thrusts, argued that tanks, not support guns, had won the campaign. As a result, production of the Stu-G was briefly curtailed in favor of building more panzer divisions. It was a short-sighted decision, one that would later be reversed under the harsh realities of the Eastern Front. For in the vast spaces of Russia, the Sturmgeschütz would find its true calling. There, amidst endless forests and open plains, German troops faced new enemies, new weapons, and new tactics. The old idea of the assault gun, a weapon for breaking fortifications, would soon evolve into something far more critical. The defender's best friend, the ambusher's perfect tool, the quiet killer that turned every ridge and every hedgerow into a fortress. And so, from a modest concept born in the mind of an artillery officer, the Sturmgeschütz III began its transformation from an infantry support gun to one of the deadliest tank destroyers of the war, a machine that, without ever having a turret, would become the iron backbone of a crumbling empire. The success of the Sturmgeschütz III did not rest on sheer power or speed, but on the balance of simplicity, precision, and mechanical economy. At its core, it was a pragmatic design, a lesson in how necessity and efficiency could shape a machine of war. When engineers at Daimler-Benz and Alkit began refining the early models, their goal was not to outmatch enemy tanks and firepower, but to create a vehicle that could be built quickly, maintained easily, and survive long enough to do its job. In a war that demanded numbers as much as quality, that philosophy would make the Stu-G one of the most significant armored vehicles of its time. The foundation of this design was the Panzer III chassis, an established platform already proven in combat. Its 6-pair road wheels, supported by a torsion bar suspension, offered a smooth ride over rough terrain and allowed precise maneuvering, even in narrow or broken ground. The engine, the dependable Maybach HL120TRM, a 12-cylinder gasoline unit producing about 300 horsepower, gave the vehicle enough power to move its 24 tons of steel at a respectable 40 kilometers per hour on road. It was not fast, but it was steady, capable of advancing beside the infantry or retreating under fire without mechanical failure. What distinguished the Stu-G from every other armored vehicle of its class was its casemate structure, the fixed armor hull that replaced the traditional rotating turret. This decision, seemingly restrictive, was the essence of its brilliance. By removing the turret, the designers eliminated the complex ring mechanisms, the vertical drive systems, and much of the weight and cost that burdened conventional tanks. The result was a low, compact profile that stood a little higher than a man. Its silhouette was nearly invisible against the contours of the battlefield, allowing it to hide behind embankments or rubble and strike from ambush. The fixed gun mount, though limited to a lateral movement of about 24 degrees, was more stable and accurate than a turreted system, particularly for firing on the move. The armor layout reflected the same logic of economy and effectiveness. Early production versions, such as the Ausführung A and B, carried frontal armor of 50 millimeters, enough to resist most anti-tank guns of the early war years. As combat experience accumulated, the thickness was steadily increased. By the time of the Ausführung G, introduced at the end of 1942, the frontal plate reached 80 millimeters, sloped to deflect incoming rounds, while additional side skirts, known as Schürze, were fitted to protect against anti-tank rifles and shaped charges. The upper hull was simplified, the driver's periscope removed to ease production, and new return rollers made entirely of steel replaced the scarce rubber rim type, a sign of Germany's growing material shortages. The most striking feature of the later models was the gun mantlet. Earlier Stu-GS used a flat, welded shield, but in late 1943, a new cast design appeared, the rounded socket blende, or pig's head. This thick, curved mantle deflected shells more effectively and gave the vehicle its distinctive appearance. It also symbolized how the Stu-G evolved from a functional support weapon into a refined tank destroyer. Inside the vehicle, space was scarce but meticulously organized. The crew of 4, driver, gunner, loader, and commander, operated in close quarters, surrounded by ammunition racks and control levers. The gunner sat to the right of the main weapon, his eye fixed on the SFL.ZF periscopic sight. The loader worked in a tight arc behind him, drawing shells from the racks that lined the hull. The commander, positioned to the left, stood beneath the cupola, a small but critical feature introduced on the Ausführung G. Fitted with periscopes that could rotate a full circle, it allowed the commander to scan the battlefield without exposing himself to enemy fire. It was this simple innovation that gave the Stu-G a level of situational awareness unmatched by most other turretless vehicles, including later German designs like the Hetzer and Jagdpanzer. The fighting compartment was sealed, but not isolated. When the Maybach engine roared to life, its vibration and heat filled the hull. The air grew thick with the scent of oil and cordite, and every order had to be shouted over the metallic thunder of the tracks. Visibility was limited. Communication depended on discipline, and survival relied entirely on coordination. In that confined space, the Stu-G demanded teamwork, a harmony between men and machine that few other vehicles achieved so completely. As the war intensified, so did the need for greater firepower. The original short 75mm Stu-K 37 L/Zwanzig gun, designed for low-velocity, high-explosive shells, was no longer adequate once the Stu-GS met the heavily armored Soviet T-34 and KV-1 tanks. In the spring of 1942, the Stu-K Vierzig L/43 gun was introduced, followed soon by the slightly longer L/48. These new high-velocity weapons could fire armor-piercing and shape-charge ammunition capable of penetrating more than 80 millimeters of sloped armor at 1 kilometer. From that point, the Stu-G was no longer just an assault gun. It had become a formidable tank destroyer. To complement its main weapon, a 7.92mm MG-34 was added on the roof of the superstructure, protected by a shield to defend against enemy infantry. Later, a coaxial machine gun was fitted beside the main barrel, and smoke launchers were mounted on the sides of the hull. Each modification reflected the lessons of countless engagements, the gradual adaptation of a simple design to the brutal demands of modern warfare. Production followed the same evolutionary logic. In the early years, output was modest, a few dozen units each month. But as the conflict expanded and Germany faced increasing losses, the Stu-G became the Army's economical backbone. By 1943, under the industrial reorganization led by Albert Speer, the assembly of Stu-GS was decentralized across several plants to reduce the impact of Allied bombing. The process was simplified, parts were standardized, and sub-assemblies were shared with other vehicles. By 1944, monthly production reached nearly 500 units, making the Stu-G the most numerous fully tracked vehicle ever built by Germany. In total, more than 9,400 assault guns and an additional 1,200 howitzer variants were produced. This industrial scale was not merely a reflection of need. It was a strategic shift. The Stu-G could be built with fewer materials than a Panzer Dre or Panzer Veer. It required less training to operate, and it could be repaired in the field with relative ease. Its cost, roughly 82,000 Reichsmarks, was significantly lower than that of a turreted tank, allowing the German army to field more fighting vehicles even as resources dwindled. In this way, the Sturmgeschütz became both a weapon and a symbol of wartime pragmatism, the embodiment of a nation trying to sustain its war machine under relentless pressure. By the end of 1943, the Ausführung G dominated the battlefield. It represented a mature form of the design. Thick armor, long gun, improved optics, and a refined layout that balanced simplicity with lethality. Every part of it, from the sloped glacis to the compact cruise space, reflected a hard-earned lesson from the front. And as German industry collapsed under the weight of bombing and blockade, the Stu-G endured, a survivor of its own efficiency. But machines, however ingenious, are only as capable as the men who command them. The Stu-G's transformation was not merely mechanical. It was doctrinal. It reshaped how German units fought, how they defended, and how they adapted to a war they could no longer win through speed alone. The next phase of its story would unfold not in factories or design bureaus, but in the mud and fire of the Eastern Front, where the Sturmartillery would prove, once and for all, that precision and patience could hold a line even against overwhelming odds. The first time the Sturmgeschütz Dre went to war, Europe was already burning. In the spring of 1940, as German forces prepared for the invasion of France and the Low Countries, a small number of these new assault guns were distributed among artillery battalions for field testing. Each battalion had only a handful of vehicles, barely enough to make a statistical difference in the campaign. Yet their performance would leave a lasting impression on those who saw them in action. In the rolling countryside of northern France, the Stu-GS proved their worth almost immediately. Moving close behind advancing infantry, they crushed concrete bunkers with a few shells from their 75mm guns, silenced enemy strongpoints, and cleared pathways through towns and forests where tanks dared not enter. Infantrymen, long accustomed to advancing without adequate fire support, described the assault gun as a guardian angel of steel. Its presence meant that enemy machine guns could no longer hold ground indefinitely. The soldiers gave it a simple name, Sturmgeschütz, the assault gun, but in their voices, the word carried respect. Despite this success, the French campaign also revealed the limitations of the vehicle. Its short-barreled gun lacked the range and penetration to fight enemy armor effectively. Its narrow field of fire forced crews to reposition constantly, and in open terrain, it relied heavily on the protection of infantry. To generals like Heinz Guderian, whose doctrine of armor thrust had brought victory in weeks, such a slow and methodical weapon seemed obsolete. He argued that production should focus entirely on fast tanks with rotating turrets, not on slow, turretless assault guns. As a result, for a time, the Stu-G project was sidelined. Yet, war has a way of correcting assumptions. 2 years later, on the Eastern Front, the same qualities that made the Stu-G appear outdated would prove essential for survival. When German forces invaded the Soviet Union in the summer of 1941, they expected a short campaign. Instead, they found themselves facing a vast army equipped with new and powerful tanks, the T-34 and the KV-1, whose sloped armor and heavy guns outclassed almost every German design. Against these opponents, the short 75mm gun of the early Stu-G was nearly useless. Shells bounced off the Soviet armor, even at close range. It was a moment of crisis for German armor doctrine, and the Stu-G would become part of the answer. In the spring of 1942, the Stu-K-40 high-velocity gun was fitted to new models, dramatically increasing their power. With its longer barrel and improved ammunition, the weapon could penetrate the T-34's frontal armor at over a kilometer. At the same time, thicker armor and new optics were introduced, creating the Ausführung F and later the Ausführung G, versions that would dominate the battlefield for the rest of the war. Now, the Stu-G could not only support the infantry, it could destroy enemy tanks head-on. Combat on the Eastern Front forged the assault gun into something new. German doctrine evolved rapidly as commanders realized that the Stu-G's low profile, strong frontal armor, and accurate gun made it ideal for defensive warfare. Instead of advancing with the infantry, Stu-G batteries began to operate from concealed positions, ambushing Soviet tanks as they crossed open fields or narrow roads. Their crews became masters of camouflage and timing, waiting motionless for hours until the enemy moved into range. Then, with a single thunderous shot, they could disable a tank before slipping away to another position. It was during these brutal years that the Sturmartillerie, the assault artillery branch, earned its reputation. Its battalions, organized independently of the panzer divisions, were assigned wherever the front was weakest. Each battalion consisted of 3 batteries, each with 7 vehicles, 21 assault guns in total, commanded by officers who combined the patience of gunners with the aggression of tankers. They fought not for glory or maneuver, but to hold ground that would otherwise have been lost. One of the earliest and most successful of these units was Sturmgeschütz III 177, which fought near Stalingrad in late 1942. Its Stu-GS, painted in the gray of early war armor, engaged Soviet columns in street fighting and open steppe alike. Operating in pairs or small groups, they ambushed advancing tanks from behind the ruins of factories and collapsed buildings. Their coordination with infantry allowed them to move like shadows through the devastated city, striking with precision before withdrawing under cover of smoke. The records of the Red Army describe them with a mixture of respect and frustration, elusive, deadly, and nearly impossible to spot until it was too late. In North Africa, the assault gun also made its appearance, though in smaller numbers. There, in the dust and heat of Tunisia, Stu-GS supported German and Italian forces against the British Eighth Army. Their low silhouette made them difficult to target among the dunes, and their 75mm guns could penetrate Allied armor at long range. But the desert was harsh on machinery. Sand-clogged filters and the delicate final drive units suffered under the strain of long marches. Even so, the crews adapted, proving once again that the Stu-G's strength lay not only in steel, but in the discipline and skill of those who served inside it. By 1943, the Stu-G had become a cornerstone of German defensive operations. In battles such as Kursk, the largest tank engagement in history, assault gun units fought alongside panzers in massive armor clashes. Although the Stu-G lacked a turret, its gun was equally lethal, and in prepared positions it often outperformed more complex tanks. Crews learned to position their vehicles hull down, exposing only the gun and the thick frontal armor. In these conditions, they could destroy Soviet tanks long before being spotted. The combination of accuracy, concealment, and armor turned the Stu-G into a formidable hunter. The results spoke for themselves. By the spring of 1944, German assault guns were credited with destroying more than 20,000 enemy tanks. They had become not just a supplement to the armored forces, but their mainstay. While production of tanks like the Tiger and Panther was costly and slow, the Stu-G could be built quickly and in large numbers, compensating for the growing losses on every front. To many German soldiers, it became a symbol of reliability, a machine that, even as the war turned against them, never failed to deliver. But every advantage carried a price. Without a rotating turret, the Stu-G was vulnerable when flanked. In close combat, enemy infantry could outmaneuver it, throwing grenades or anti-tank charges onto its thin side or rear armor. To survive, Stu-G crews relied heavily on supporting troops and precise coordination. Isolated, they were easy prey. Supported, they were nearly unstoppable. It was a weapon that demanded teamwork between vehicle and infantry, between fire and movement. As the Red Army pushed westward and the Allies landed in Normandy, the Stu-G's reputation continued to grow. In Italy, in the Balkans, and in the forests of Poland, these low, angular machines held ground against forces that often outnumbered them 10-1. They fought not for glory, but for survival. And in that desperate struggle, they became, in the words of many historians, the true workhorse of the German army, a machine built for defense in a war that no longer offered victory. By the middle of 1943, the Sturmgeschütz III stood at the very center of Germany's armor doctrine. It had begun as a support gun for infantry and evolved into the most widely used armored fighting vehicle of the entire German war machine. But the battlefield was changing, and so too were the men who fought within its steel walls. The war that had once been defined by rapid advances had turned into a slow, grinding struggle for survival. And in this new kind of war, a war of defense, attrition, and desperate ingenuity, the Stu-G became indispensable. On the Eastern Front, the balance of power had shifted. The Red Army had learned from its early defeats, refining tactics and fielding ever greater numbers of tanks. The Germans, once masters of the offensive, now found themselves retreating from one defensive line to another. In this environment, the Stu-G's qualities, low-profile, accurate gun, and solid frontal armor, proved ideal. Where a heavy Tiger or Panther required open terrain to maneuver, the Stu-G could fight from ambush in the forests, villages, and ruins that now defined the front. It became a hunter's weapon, small, silent, and deadly. Reports from Sturmgeschütz III across the Eastern Front described the same pattern again and again. When Soviet armored spearheads broke through the German lines, assault gun batteries were rushed to the breach. They would take up hidden positions along roads or behind natural obstacles, waiting for the enemy columns to appear. The gunner, his eye pressed to the periscope sight, would track the lead tank as it advanced, off within just a few hundred meters. Then came a single command from the commander, "Fewer," and the 75mm shell tore through steel. In a matter of seconds, one tanked, then another went up in flames. And before the enemy could react, the Stu-GS were already reversing into cover, preparing for the next ambush. This method of fighting demanded calm precision under fire, and it made the assault gunners some of the most respected and disciplined crews in the German army. The statistics tell part of the story. By early 1944, assault gun units were responsible for more confirmed tank kills than combined panzer divisions on the Eastern Front. The Stu-G had become the backbone of Germany's anti-tank capability. It was cheaper to build than any turreted tank, fast to produce, and easier to repair. For a nation running short of fuel, rubber, and manpower, it was a logical weapon, a design born of necessity, perfected by experience, and sustained by desperation. But even the most effective weapon cannot compensate for a collapsing front. By this time, Germany's enemies were advancing on all sides. In Italy, in the Balkans, in Normandy and beyond, Allied tanks, aircraft, and artillery were overwhelming in number. The Stu-G was no longer an instrument of tactical superiority. It was a tool for delay. Wherever it appeared, it could still exact a terrible price from the attackers, but could not alter the outcome of a war already lost. In Italy, the mountainous terrain made the Stu-G especially valuable. Its low height and powerful gun allowed it to dominate narrow passes and ridgelines, ambushing Allied columns as they climbed the steep roads northward. However, the harsh conditions and the strain of constant movement exposed weaknesses in the design. The final drive units, delicate by nature, often failed after long marches or heavy combat. Crews adapted by cannibalizing parts from wrecked vehicles, turning each working Stu-G into a patchwork of salvaged steel. Even in these desperate conditions, the assault gun maintained its fearsome reputation. Allied tankers learned to fear the sudden flash of a 75mm gun from an unseen slope, beyond Germany's own forces. The Stu-G found new life in the hands of its allies. In 1943, Finland received 59 Stu-G III Ausführung GS as part of its cooperation with Germany against the Soviet Union. Finnish crews quickly grew fond of the machine, calling it Sturmi, a shortened nickname that carried affection as well as respect. In the battles of Karelia and the summer offensives of 1944, these Finnish Stu-GS destroyed 87 Soviet tanks at the cost of only 8 vehicles. For a small army fighting against overwhelming odds, the assault gun became a symbol of resilience. After the war, Finland kept its Sturmis in service for 2 decades, upgrading them with concrete armor and improved optics, a testament to their durability and practicality. Other nations also made use of the Stu-G. Romania received 100 vehicles, officially designated as TA-TRE, and used them against the Soviets until the final months of the war. Hungary, Bulgaria, and even Italy fielded small numbers. After the conflict ended, many captured or abandoned Stu-GS were repaired and repurposed by their new owners. The Soviet Union refurbished hundreds of them and shipped them to its allies in the Middle East. By the early 1950s, Syrian forces operated Stu-GS alongside T-34 tanks, And some of these aging German machines were still firing in anger during the Six-Day War of 1967 and Yom Kippur War of 1973. Their long service life, across continents and generations, revealed the extraordinary longevity of their design. Back in Germany, production continued under increasingly dire circumstances. Allied bombing raids had devastated major factories, including Alkit's main plant in Berlin-Tegel. To keep the assault gun in production, parts of the assembly line were transferred to the MIG company in Braunschweig, and components were built wherever machines and manpower could still be found. Simplifications became standard. Flat plates replaced complex castings, and field conversions turned damaged Panzer Dre chassis into new Stu-GS. By the end of 1944, more Stu-GS were rolling off the lines than any other German armored vehicle, a paradoxical triumph of efficiency amid ruin. In those same final months, the Stu-G's role expanded once again. In the ruins of cities like Warsaw, Budapest, and Berlin, it became a weapon of urban defense. Crews positioned their vehicles at street corners or behind piles of rubble, turning every intersection into a potential killing zone. In these close-quarters battles, the lack of a turret was less of a handicap. The gun's stability and accuracy at short range made it ideal for street fighting, and its low silhouette allowed it to fire from cover that would conceal almost any other tank. But the cost was terrible. Many Stu-GS were destroyed by infantry armed with portable anti-tank weapons, and few of their crews survived to see the end. As the Reich crumbled, the assault gun that had once been a symbol of innovation became a tool of desperation. Its crews, often teenagers or hastily trained replacements, fought with grim determination but little hope. Yet even in those final battles, the machine earned the respect of friend and foe alike. In the shattered streets of Berlin, Soviet tankers later recalled how well-concealed Stu-GS could still strike with deadly accuracy, delaying their advance block by block. For a weapon designed almost a decade earlier, it was a remarkable testament to endurance. When the war ended, the Sturmgeschütz III stood as both a symbol of Germany's military ingenuity and of the desperate economy that had driven its creation. More than any other armored vehicle of the Second World War, it represented the shift from ambition to survival, from the sweeping offensives of the early war to the grinding defense of its final years. But its legacy did not vanish with the Reich that built it. In many ways, the Stu-G was a glimpse of the future. For engineers and strategists alike, the Stu-G embodied a fundamental truth, that effectiveness in war does not always depend on complexity, but on balance, the precise relationship between firepower, protection, and cost. The German army had poured resources into heavy tanks like the Tiger and Panther, whose mechanical brilliance often exceeded the nation's industrial capacity. Yet it was a humble Stu-G, the stripped-down assault gun, that bore the weight of Germany's armor warfare. Its design was not a monument of perfection, but to practicality. Every rivet, every plate of sloped armor, every angle of its casemate was defined by necessity. That pragmatism carried a lesson that outlived the conflict. When the smoke cleared, other nations took note. The Soviet Union had already followed a similar path during the war, with its Su series of self-propelled guns, vehicles that shared the same concept of a fixed gun on a tank chassis. After the victory, the Red Army continued the idea with the ISU-122 and ISU-152, massive assault guns that mirrored the Stu-G's philosophy on a larger scale. In Britain and the United States, the post-war years saw the development of vehicles like the M36 Jackson and A-30 Challenger, tank destroyers that owed part of their lineage to the German approach, powerful guns mounted on simplified, cost-effective hulls. The age of the dedicated assault gun was short-lived, but its influence reshaped armored doctrine for decades. For all its mechanical brilliance, the Stu-G story was also deeply human. Inside its cramped interior, for men shared a space barely large enough to stand upright. The driver, hunched over his controls, guided the 24-ton machine through mud, snow, and fire. The gunner adjusted his sight with delicate precision, waiting for the brief moment when the enemy entered his field of vision. The loader, working in the deafening roar of the gun, fed shell after shell into the breech until his arms trembled from exhaustion. And the commander, perched beneath his cupola, carried the responsibility of every decision: when to fire, when to move, when to stay hidden. Their survival depended on trust as much as on steel. The Sturmartillerie, the branch that manned these vehicles, developed its own culture within the German army. They were not tankers, and they did not think like them. Where panzer crews saw mobility and breakthrough, the assault gunner saw geometry and patience. They were soldiers of precision, fighting not with speed but with calculation. Many of them came from artillery backgrounds, trained to read the ground, to estimate range and angle, to strike unseen targets with mathematical calm. In their discipline, the Stu-G found its soul. The respect they earned was reflected in the unit records. Some battalions reported kill ratios of 10 enemy tanks, destroyed for every Stu-G lost. Their efficiency made them legends among German troops and a feared adversary to those who faced them. Yet the men who fought inside them rarely saw themselves as heroes. To most, the Stu-G was simply a tool, reliable, predictable, and honest. It did what it was designed to do and no more. In the years after the war, the surviving vehicles scattered across Europe. Finland, which had received its Sturmers from Germany in 1943, kept them operational into the early 1960s. The Finns, ever practical, upgraded them with improved optics and concrete armor, turning wartime relics into credible post-war weapons. In Syria, the Stu-G story continued even longer. A number of captured vehicles, supplied by the Soviet Union, fought in the Arab-Israeli conflicts of the 1950s and 60s. Photographs from the Golan Heights in 1967 show their familiar silhouette, low, angular, unmistakable, half buried in sand and history. Few machines have carried the legacy of one war into another so vividly. Museums today display the Stu-G as an artifact of engineering, but significance is greater than the sum of its steel. It marks the point where industrial necessity and tactical ingenuity converged. It is a reminder that, even in an era of vast machines and massive armies, innovation can arise not from grandeur, but from restraint. By removing what was unnecessary, the turret, the excess weight, the luxury of speed, German engineers had created something brutally efficient. It was a weapon stripped to its essence. That essence still echoes in the design philosophies of modern armored vehicles. The principles of low profile, compact silhouette, and concentrated frontal armor remain vital to tank design even in the 21st century. In every self-propelled gun, in every tank destroyer, and even in many modern infantry fighting vehicles, there are traces of the same logic that shaped the Sturmgeschütz III. Its influence extends beyond engineering. It is the embodiment of adaptation itself. But its legacy is not without irony. The same qualities that made the Stu-G successful, its simplicity, efficiency, and cost-effectiveness, were born from the pressures of total war, from a system that valued production over humanity. Each Stu-G that rolled off the line represented the triumph of engineering and the tragedy of purpose. It was a machine built to sustain a war that could no longer be won, a masterpiece forged in the service of destruction. As the war ended, many of the men who had served in the Sturmartillerie returned to civilian life, carrying the memory of those years. The smell of oil and smoke, the weight of steel beneath their hands, the sound of their gun echoing through ruined cities. For them, the Stu-G was not just a weapon but companion, a shield, and sometimes a coffin. In their stories, one senses the dual nature of the machine, its mechanical precision and its human cost. Today, when historians speak of the great armored icons of the Second World War, they often mention the Tiger, the Panther, or the Sherman. But in the shadows of those giants lies the Stu-G, modest, uncelebrated, yet indispensable. It was a weapon that filled the gaps, that held the line when others failed, that proved that effectiveness need not come from excess. It was, in every sense, the soldier's tank, though it was never a tank at all. And so, the story of the Sturmgeschütz III ends as it began, not with triumph or spectacle, but with quiet efficiency. It was born from the lessons of the past, shaped by the needs of the present, and destined to influence the future. It turned artillery into armor, and armor into doctrine. It changed how wars were fought, and how engineers thought. In the end, it stands as more than a weapon. It is a monument to the power of design under pressure, to the discipline of the men who used it, and to the paradox of progress born from destruction. Because these machines were not merely tools of war. They were expressions of human ingenuity under its darkest shadow. And if one wishes to understand how engineering shaped the course of the 20th century, one must begin here, with the assault gun that became the quiet heart of a global conflict. If you wish to understand how machines can change history, not by noise or size, but by precision and purpose, stay with us. This is WW2 Mechanics.